So Bob was a pioneer in the field of money and politics and really trying to get to the heart of this issue about how big, powerful interests were influencing our democracies. There was a whole generation of people who really woke up to how are we going to look at these power structures. He was doing the original research and figuring out who were these interests that were influencing our democracy. And that was a thread that ran through a lot of the work at the Institute for Southern Studies.
Well, the Institute had been founded, I think, in '72. Julian Bond, Sue Thrasher, Howard Romaine were the key founders. The idea behind the Institute was really to try to bring more solid research and to help guide movement organizing, social change organizing in the South. Bob, Sue, and Howard all had come out of SOC, Southern Student Organizing Committee, which was primarily a white organization of students, but who were active in the civil rights movement. They all had a kind of faith-based background.
Both of his grandfathers were clergy. One was a missionary, one was a pastor. And when he and his twin, Richard, were born, one of his grandfathers said, Richard will be a pastor and Bob will be a missionary. And Bob feels like that has been true. He is a missionary, but he's a missionary for democracy.
In 1973, I moved up here with Jackie, my wife then, and brought Southern Exposure magazine with me at that time. And so there was an office in Atlanta, an office here.
Bob, being a student of history, being a student of the politics of the South, saw understanding the political economy of the South as a colony as being a core issue that Southern Exposure and the Institute really needed to illuminate.
Bob's work was really into the research, and he was quite driven by it, handling all that, detail numbers and all in the early publications that we did, all those charts. And I actually ended up being the one to draw many of the charts. I could handle a tedium. All that data, that was all Bob's thrust.
Bob was a pioneer not just in the field of money and politics, but really inspiring an entire generation of activists and researchers and scholars about this question of who holds power. Who are these people? What do they look like? What's their agenda? And most importantly, what can we do about it? And it was really in, I think, the early 1990s, a democratic reform project sprung up at the Institute, and that became Democracy South.
At today's Democracy South seminar, speakers voiced their concerns about the need for change.
A political system that cuts out folks who don't have money, power, and influence.
And there's a direct line from that work to the work of Democracy North Carolina today.
What was unique about Bob is that he very much embodied the civil rights movement. He also embodied the anti-war movement. He also was a very religious person, was Southwest Memphis. He was able to take those parts of himself and help be the glue in between generations.
Bob and I got along famously from the beginning. I thought he was a throwback to old 60s liberal. I knew what those folks stood for.
North Carolina is not only one of the largest states in the country, it is typical of the states in the country where the huge majority of the campaign financing, the money to run elections, comes from very few people. Terribly corrosive effect on elections. In North Carolina, there was one leading organization with that understanding and said that's going to be the focus of our activity. Democracy North Carolina has played a very special role in doing that.
There was a scandal, a campaign finance reform scandal with House Speaker Jim Black. And Bob was the first to really notice some inconsistencies in his campaign finances. And Bob got a lot of backlash for that from Democrats in the state. But to me, it really speaks to Bob's desire and commitment to participatory democracy, clean elections, and really centering voters in this process, regardless of political party.
We are a very conservative organization and a very radical organization because we really believe in this foundation of one person, one vote. What we want is the integrity of a government that works for everybody that allows everybody to participate, that is not poisoned by money, by special interest.
There were several real milestones and successes in the work that we were doing those days. I mean, the first thing probably was we enhanced disclosure of what was going on around elections and who was given money. The biggest achievement, I feel like, came on getting public financing for the North Carolina appellate courts, the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and that was a multi-year effort.
I think people have to struggle to say, I'm not going to be driven away. This is my country, by God. My voice is my vote, and I will vote, and I will tell my neighbors to vote, and I will organize to have my interests represented.
North Carolina was in the worst 5 states in the country in terms of turnout. Democracy North Carolina's research and Bob Hall's work came forward with a whole package of reforms.
As we organized, the people we were organizing started telling us, why don't we get better early voting? Why don't we get Sunday voting? Sunday voting during early voting? Wow, that's a cool idea. Souls to the polls. That was 2004. We were getting involved in the election side of things, and the whole idea of same-day registration came from the grassroots, came from the field.
They were innovations that nobody was thinking about or talking about in the General Assembly. If it weren't for Democracy North Carolina and the role they played, they wouldn't have been a part of the conversation. And as a result, we have voter turnout that 4 or 5 years ago moved us up above the majority of the states in the country.
There's no other organization that has the same knowledge of the nitty-gritty election administration details, really knowing what goes on election day, during early voting, when people go to vote, like Democracy North Carolina does.
After the 2010 elections and the immediate attacks on voting rights, one of the main things that the conservative legislators were trying to do was to sort of raise concern about fraud. Bob had this idea to look for his own name, Robert Hall, born the same year that Bob was born, to find another registered voter in a different state. And along with that, he decided to look up some of our state legislators to see if he could find their names on voter registration rolls in other states. And he did.
Federal appeals court has struck down a North Carolina voter ID law. Civil rights groups have slammed the law since the beginning, claiming it discriminates against minorities and the poor. Supporters argued it helps prevent voter fraud.
When you do the research and dig down into it, these legislators weren't registered in 2 states. It was just someone who shared their name and birthday. I really appreciated that effort by Bob, because not only did it highlight the issue of bad research and the sort of witch hunt around voter fraud that's been happening here in the past several years, but it did that in a way that grabbed people's attention.
We've got a short statement, and then we also have Robert Chadwick here, who's one of the voters who was falsely accused. I'm going to ask him to say a few words, and then we'll have questions and so on. Wrongdoing is wrong, and it must be called out and held accountable. Today, we are calling for a criminal investigation of a possible conspiracy by the Pat McCrory Re-Election Committee and the North Carolina Republican Party to use fraudulent charges of voter fraud to harass and intimidate voters, deny them their right to vote, interfere with the election process, and corrupt the results of the 2016 elections.
Our democracy is only as real as our engagement in it. What we have is a state that has had a robust movement for civil rights and social justice. We've got institutions like Democracy North Carolina that have been a part of that fight. We're pushing for access for all voters. We're pushing for voter laws to be enforced fairly. We're pushing elections officials to do their jobs. We're working our democracy.
We come here to protect a sacred history in which too much blood was shed. We come and we stand in the name of Medgar Evers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. To talk about voting rights is Mr. Bob Hall.
Democracy North Carolina is happy to be here. One person, one vote. Say it. One person, one vote. One person, one vote. Hear yourselves. One person, one vote. We will not be silenced. We will be heard.
Bob is very clear that the work he does and has done has always been a part of the long civil rights movement. And today he reminds us as staff at MNC that sometimes when we don't get the credit that we feel that we should, that's okay, because it's not about the organizational credit or the organizational brand, it's about our contribution to the broader movement.
What I think Bob's work helped him get and understand was, how do you follow these institutional relationships? What does it mean to follow the money? Bob's understanding of the vulnerability of the infrastructure for democracy, I think he was way ahead of the game.
Bob had a view of more the advocacy, but it was informed advocacy. His sense that data can be married with emotion kind of creates a winning combination.
They call it power mapping now, a lot of the analysis of trying to identify who has the power, what are the influences on that center of power, and where can you bring your forces to bear. I'll say that a lot of my research comes out of just being a fifth grade math student, that I can add and subtract really quick. The piece that I learned early on is that don't think of research as some academic exercise. It's really detective work. You're trying to find the answer to some problem.
Bob has been the repository of good information that he's willing to share about how people vote, how many people vote, what the registration is, and that has helped inform the work that I do.
Democracy NC's most significant accomplishment is building out, organizing staff and capacity to scale, and being one of the only organizations to make that level of investment. Particularly around voting rights, a national organization will call and say, we have this great resource. It's a How to Vote in North Carolina guide, and we want to make 300,000 copies of it. And Bob will say, he'll see it, it will actually have incorrect information. Or he'll say directly to them, like, we could actually produce this for ourselves and it would be actually correct, and you could just send us the money.
We would go all over the state of North Carolina working with community members. I mean, this might be 15 people in Franklin out in western North Carolina, 10 people in Elizabeth City. But I always was struck by the wide diversity. Democracy North Carolina was playing a part in bringing people together.
Well, Democracy North Carolina has these GOTV coalitions across the state in different counties, and those coalitions are made of a smaller organization. So let's say the local NAACP or another local community-based organization. And so they print materials en masse, whether that's voter guides or the Martin Luther King brochures.
Bob was good at knowing different folks to call together to do things, but his trying to constantly work at developing relationships. Where he found an organization or local leaders, he would kind of plug in. His relationship with Reverend Barber right now is like his ideal.
Say voting rights, the battle, we must fight, and we will win.
Yeah, probably the classic Bob is, I'm gonna have this party and all these people are gonna come over, and it's like, we're gonna do a mailing. Yet another mailing.
He would go to meetings, he would always have a box of envelopes that he's, addressing or folding, and it was constant.
It is a fight. It is hard. It does take energy. It takes time. You don't win all the time. Over the long run, though, if you look, the arc of history points toward justice. We have to keep that in mind and keep fighting for it.
First impressions, I thought he was a curmudgeon. The thought, that comes to mind, but I don't mean that literally, more figuratively, that he worked night and day, that he seemed to never stop working. I thought perhaps he didn't sleep, or maybe there were two of them and we only got to see one of them.
When I first started working with Bob and his daughter Cecilia was still in high school, and Bob works from his home, I would call and you'd hear in the background this operatic voice. That was his daughter, Cecilia. I just always remember that and thinking about, gosh, that's pretty nice.
Some of the meetings I would go to his house, deep in the woods, and it was a beautiful place, and I know he walked the dog and he spent a lot of time outside, and that's when I kind of learned, like, he's finding time to do the reflection or to take the breaks that he needs.
Bob's motivation for this work comes from a place of being a helper. I didn't think of Bob as a helper because he works very independently, but he doesn't like seeing other people suffer, and he really can't stand seeing people being oppressed and disenfranchised.
There were numerous times working with Bob that I could just feel how the work that he was doing was piercing through the hypocrisy of the ruling establishment. I think we need more of that.
North Carolina has this broad pro-democracy movement, and you just think about the range of organizations. It's totally unique of almost any state, definitely in the South, probably in the country. And these are all groups that were inspired by, informed by Bob Hall.
Bob was only a couple of years older than I was when we met, and he's still only a couple of years older than I am today. The thing that's always seemed true to me is he seemed to have a pretty good, far-sighted sense of what to do and how to do it, a sense of strategic vision.
I would just say the thing that I appreciate a lot about Bob is that he is a white male with a great deal of privilege, running an organization that leans into being an anti-racist and a leader in that space, and really calls questions to, like, how is this helping engaging the people most impacted by the things that we're fighting, whether that's voting rights or environmental reform or other types of issues, housing issues. There's so many different issues. I love him deeply, and I'm going to miss him as the leader of Democracy North Carolina, but I don't plan to let him get too far away.
Paul and Silas, bound in jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize.
Underlying a lot of this, yeah, there's certainly persistence, tenacity, commitment, audacity, experimentation, opportunism when you see a chance, when you have a little bit of a glimmer of where it's going on, go for it. Racial justice, that's at the core of where we come from and where we got to be. Economic justice. We're against crimes against democracy. There are these crimes against democracy that are sinful. I was brought up in a church. I was brought up totally in the church, the morality of it. But it's not just the morality of it. There's the material reality as well. There's the values and the material reality. And the substance and the pain is real. And people got to battle that. And that's what I think, people have to feel that and then apply all the skills they have to fight.